This is part of a series of webinars building into the reporting process for the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. Your role here is really powerful. It's about changing the things that need changed in Scotland. This isn't just a report that goes up on a shelf. This is actually part of a living process. And so focus today on children whose rights are most at risk is really important. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Bruce. I'm the Children and Young People's Commissioner Scotland. I always describe it as the best job in the world because it's my job to promote and safeguard the rights of all of the children all across Scotland, everyone up to the age of 18 or to 21 for care experienced young people, and with a special focus on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And interestingly, within my legislation, it also says that I need to pay particular attention to those groups of children and young people who don't have other adequate means by which their views can be known. So it frames it as a participation element rather than a rights are most at risk. And importantly, my job is to provide a bridge between the international human rights framework and the domestic realization of the rights of children and young people. So for the purpose of the UNCRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's primarily the Committee on the Rights of the Child, but other parts of the UN system, such as the Human Rights Council, which will be examining the UK in just over a week, also look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child as well. And so it's important that actually the work that you're doing here will feed directly into the Committee on the Rights of the Child, but also be really useful for other parts of the UN system as well. And children have to be right at the heart of that process. So your role as civil society is vital to make sure that the committee and other parts of the UN understand children's voices. But the research, the data, the stuff that the UN committee needs in order to understand Scotland is absolutely essential in them making very clear recommendations to the UK and Scottish government. But it's important to recognise that there are a broad array of international human rights instruments for the rights of children, but the UNCRC is special because it was the first one to bring together all of the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, along with humanitarian and environmental law to some extent, into one cohesive document. And it starts with the idea that children should grow up in a family environment of happiness and love and understanding. And it really changed the way that we saw children in international human rights law and led to cultural change in the domestic context as well. Rather than being passive objects of charity, children are human beings with distinct sets of rights from birth. And the rights contained within the Convention are universal, interdependent, and interrelated, and cover every aspect of children's lives and explain how those in power must work together to ensure that rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled. And so cover really important things in terms of adequate standard of living and the highest attainable standard of health and education, which develops children to their fullest potential, but also includes things like extra care and protection for disabled children and care experienced children and others. Really importantly for our purposes today are the fact that there's participation rights within the Convention in terms of, while children and young people don't generally have the right to vote, they don't have the same political and economic power as adults, they've got the right to be involved in decision-making in relation to everything that affects them. That's in an individual level, but it also includes feeding into processes like UN reporting. And I think that's really important, is that children have got a right to be not just involved in this process, but right at the heart of it. Also requires the state to use all available resources to the maximum extent possible to ensure that rights are fulfilled, particularly economic, social, and cultural rights. And so one of the things that I think is important about the discussion today is when we're looking at children whose rights are most at risk, how are budgetary decisions taken in relation to those children and young people? How do we prioritise? As part of the 30th anniversary of the CRC a few years ago, we asked children to describe human rights in just 7 words. And some of you will have heard some of these before, but some of my favorites are things like, my rights are my armor to me. It's about protection. Right to help before you even ask. The fact that there's proactive duties on government, positive obligations. My rights give me power, freedom, courage. This idea that rights are empowering things, and being part of the process of claiming your rights is really important. And my favorite, not that I have favorites, is humans have rights, dinosaurs don't, they died, which is actually amazing in terms of bringing about lots of discussions around who has rights and who don't. Do dinosaurs or aliens or people in ancient civilizations have rights? What are rights? Why do they matter? Do pets have rights is one we talk about quite a lot. And that leads into discussions about why children's rights are so important, and why focus on particular children. One of the 7-word stories was, "My rights matter, your rights matter too." And that brings me to the heart of the discussion today. If rights are universal, then why should we be spending time looking at particular groups of children? Given the unique nature of the human experience and its complexity, is there a risk that by labeling children by a particular characteristic or experience, that we start to lose some of the holistic nature of rights and universality? And how do we frame them, and how do we start, how do we stop? And so for today's discussion, we've got a series of 8 workshops later on early years and young children, disabled children, asylum seeking and refugee children, Black, brown and minority ethnic children, LGBT children, care experienced children, children in the justice system, young carers. So that's 8 particular groups or groupings of children and young people, characteristics or experiences that we know we're particularly concerned about. But each one of those groups contains children with a vast collection of circumstances and experiences, all with equally important voices. And there's lots of subsets within those groups that could probably be categorized as their own set in and of themselves. And there's huge overlaps between these groups as well. So what are some of the other groups we need to be thinking about? Gypsy traveller children, children of prisoners. What else? Start to have some of those conversations about not only the group that you'll be discussing today, but the interlinkages between those groups and other children. So when we start to talk about children whose rights are most at risk, I was reflecting on the discussions we had during COVID and people challenging the statement that we're all in the same boat, saying we're not in the same boats. We're in the same storm in lots of different boats. I think we should probably go further. Actually, children are in lots of different storms, in lots of different boats. It's much more complex than that. I think the analogy starts to fall apart quite quickly when you think about the individual experience of children. But the importance of looking at characteristics or experiences, though, is that there's some commonality that allow us to shape recommendations which will deliver that change. It's not putting children into those boxes. It's about ensuring that they've got an ability to share their experience on that part of their life that allows us to form recommendations for change. So how does the UNCRC itself and the committee approach this difficult boat storm challenge? How do we identify children and without putting them in boxes? In Article 2 of the Convention, it sets out the requirements, a general requirement not to discriminate against children, and then includes a non-exhaustive list, which highlights particular characteristics on race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national, ethnic or social origin, property, disability, birth, or other status. And then other status has been developed in international human rights law to include lots of things like sexual orientation, illegitimacy, marital status, trade union membership, trans status, imprisonment. So I'm not sure how hugely useful it is in terms of narrowing things down, but it gives us a very clear indication that the drafters of the convention were already concerned about particular characteristics leading to additional risks in a number of ways. Then the Convention on the Rights of itself, the Convention on the Rights of the Child itself, highlights some particular characteristics and experiences in a few different ways. And so it picks up particular groups of children. And so, for example, disabled children have Article 23 in the Convention, which develops a series of rights unique to disabled children. And of course, this has been bolstered further by a separate UN treaty, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which brings together the rights of disabled people of all ages, but applies equally to children and young people. Care experienced children have additional rights protections scattered through the Convention, recognising the breadth of their lived experience. So special care and assistance for those temporarily or permanently deprived of their family environment. Also special protections around adoption in Article 21. That was children in conflict with the law have additional rights protections in that context as well. And so the Convention actually sets within some contexts quite extensive rights that are particular to children who are experiencing particular circumstances like being in conflict with the law. And so the drafters of the CRC have put their minds already to the groups and circumstances where rights might most be at risk. The committee from time to time puts out general comments, which are authoritative instruction on how to interpret the convention, or to build on certain thematic issues. And they've often picked on children whose rights are most at risk for further discussion within general comments. And so asylum seeking and refugee children and general comments 6, 22 and 23 all build on their rights. There's a particular general comment, number 7, on the rights in early childhoods, number 9 on disabled children. And the committee has twice done specific pieces of work around children in the child justice system, children in conflict with the law, general comment 10, which was updated recently to become general comment 24. They've also done general comments on things like children affected by HIV, on Indigenous children and other children. So the committee's consistently shown us about the importance of focusing in on particular experiences or characteristics of children. And again, one of the most recent days of general discussion was on care experienced children and young people, children in alternative care. Again, I'd invite you to have a think about that as well. What's missing from the committee's jurisprudence on this? What should we look for in future in terms of things that could be in general comments? Also, the wider human rights system itself recognises the importance of special attention for those whose rights are most at risk. We've got specialised treaties on the elimination of racial discrimination, on the protection of the rights of persons with disabilities, on the elimination of discrimination against women. And much of this has been replicated as well at the Council of Europe and the EU level, and often built further upon. So the Istanbul Convention, for example, on violence against women and girls, is a Council of Europe convention, which is really important in terms of building our human rights-based approach to violence against women and girls. And again, that's again another important piece of work that we could be looking at in terms of rights most at risk. The recent children's rights strategies from both the Council of Europe and the EU, which is still an important source of children's rights development, despite not being directly binding on us at the moment. And both of them highlight particular attention towards groups of children and young people. Both of them, interestingly, focus on poverty as a group and inequality, and focusing on that. So that's probably a really long-winded way of saying that there's a fantastic rights framework there. You don't really need to know about all of that, though. In fact, the purpose of this process, you don't really need to know it at all, because everything that you talk about and bring, there'll be a home for it in the rights framework. But for the discussions today, the starting point, rather than the rights framework, I think needs to be the lived experience of the children and young people that you all work with and for. And that's why it's the discussions and the conversations that you're having today really matter in terms of feeding into this process. So don't dwell too much on the technical nature of what the specific rights are, but it's really about your expertise and ability to bring children's voices into the experience of this process. The UNCRC reporting process, it's a living process, it's ongoing, it develops and builds over time. Just to focus on some of the key areas that I think are important in terms of children whose rights are most at risk, and some of the work that my office has been doing. And so the first one I think that's important to recognise is that this part of the reporting process, we're still very much in the context of the global COVID pandemic, which has disproportionately affected children and young people, and particularly those whose rights were already most at risk. And so it's affected all of us. It's affected children disproportionately, rights to education, health, family life, to gather with friends, rights to development. But those whose rights were already most at risk have definitely been the most impacted: disabled children, care experienced children, young carers, those experiencing poverty. All the groups that we were already discussing were disproportionately affected by COVID. And many children are continuing to deal with health effects from the pandemic, but also things like bereavement, also changes to financial circumstances. So it's really important that we include those voices and experiences and that change that children have been through as part of the reporting process. back at the beginning of the pandemic, the Committee on the Rights of the Child warned of the grave physical, emotional, and psychological effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on children. That was way back in April 2020. And they called on states to take a rights-based approach to response to the pandemic, rather than just seeing it as a health issue. And the independent children's rights impact assessment undertaken by the Observatory for Children's Human Rights in Scotland and supported and advised by Together brought together some really fantastic experts to look at the framework for some of those rights within the context of the pandemic, and health, mental health, education, poverty, but also things like rest and recreation, child protection, child abuse, additional support needs and disability, children in conflict with the law, and insecure care. And so I think that framework's really useful to draw upon when we work at the reporting process. Participation, I think is something that I always want to come back to in these discussions, because those whose rights are most at risk are often also those who we are worst at in ensuring their participation in decision making. And that difficult balance that we need to strike in terms of when we can support children and young people to have their own voices heard, but also making sure that we're backing that up with research and data and other things. When are we asking children to speak of their experience? How are we doing that safely? There's a whole nother discussion around participation. Mental health, I think, is a really important one, and a wider discussion in terms of where this fits in. Obviously, we're talking about disabled children, but mental health is an issue that affects children who aren't disabled as well. But we're doing quite a lot of work on mental health at the moment. We've got a live investigation at the moment led by young investigators into counselling in schools, but also doing a lot of work around the legal structures around mental health. Even prior to the pandemic, mental health was highlighted by young people to us as one of the biggest issues, and it's so much worse now. The same is true as poverty. That was the other big issue that children and young people raised with us prior to the pandemic, which is significantly worse now. Time doesn't allow to go into a full-on discussion around that. But I think it's interesting in terms of the fact that certain groups of children and young people are more at risk of poverty. But then the group of children who are experiencing poverty can be seen, in my view, as a category in and of themselves, as being a category with their rights most at risk. So all children who experience poverty have some common issues and common concerns, and the political failure is absolutely shocking in terms of addressing poverty. And this has been something the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty raised back in 2019, and we've been working, all of us, I think, for many years, but things are particularly bad at the moment. And so we're doing work at the European level and the UK level and within Scotland around poverty. But I think poverty is not just an issue of adequate standard of living, but it's an issue of survival and development. And I think that this is hugely concerning. And I think it is important, therefore, that we look at children experiencing poverty as a group in and of themselves, even though the routes into poverty can be quite different and can be complicated. I want to focus on children in conflict with the law. While in December we raised the age of criminal responsibility to 12 in Scotland, it's still 2 years below the international minimum, and that's outrageous, and that needs to be a really strong part of our call within this, and also the fact we continue to imprison children, despite a commitment from the Scottish Government to eventually change that. There's a real level of urgency in Scotland. We know the impact of children, the impact on children of being in a prison setting, and it's unacceptable. Lots of interesting discussions, I think, to be had around the situation for asylum seekers, situation in secure accommodation, but I'm probably going to finish up. Restraint and seclusion for disabled children, huge issue that we're concerned about. But bringing it back, I suppose, to the discussion that we can have, please do think about how that might link over into other groups and some of those commonalities as well, because it's important that we look at these groups of children and categories and experiences, because that's the way to get clear recommendations. But that doesn't mean that we're putting children into boxes and saying that that's the only thing that they are, and that's really important as well. And it comes back to the idea that children and young people were saying with their 7-word stories about my rights matter, your rights matter too. And I think that's hugely important, that the work that you're all doing through being here and being part of this process of reporting to the UN is going to make a huge difference, that rights being my armor to me and rights being helped before I even ask. So thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the discussions just now and through the working groups as well.